We'll now move on to our second panel, and for the benefit of anyone that's watching, for clarity, this is reverting back to our inquiry on the Forensic Science Service, another inquiry that we're running in parallel with the previous one. Can I welcome Mr. Ennison and Professor Silverman to the meeting, and for the record invite you to introduce yourselves.
I'm Bernard Silverman. I'm the Home Office Chief Scientific Advisor.
Good morning, Andy Renison. I'm the Forensic Science Regulator and now also the Surveillance Camera Commissioner. Good morning.
Since we met you both a while back, the process of disposal of the FSS has gone ahead. The market has changed since then in forensics, and we have taken quite a bit of evidence over the last few weeks from people in the private sector, in the public sector, in the Met, from ACPO, and we do have some concerns about the way forward, which we want to explore with you today. So can I first of all ask you whether, in your view, the government has a strategy for forensic science beyond simply encouraging a market?
Thank you very much. I'll start with that one. At the moment, I struggle to know what the government strategy is. I think that was a nodding agreement. Excuse me. There have been government strategies which took us through the privatisation, took us through the DNA expansion project, and it is something I have been making noises about for a while. But I am pleased to say, Chair, that the strategy group, the forensic policy group that is now formed to deal with that, meets this morning. And as soon as I finish here, I'm straight back to the Home Office to meet with that group and discuss what I think is a very promising agenda.
I would add that Andrew sits on the Forensic Policy Group. I don't sit personally, but my deputy and also the head of CAST, the Centre for Applied Science and Technology, which is part of Home Office Science, also sit on that group. And my understanding is that that group is the one tasked to take forward the strategy. So we are placed to make sure that science and technology has its place in formulating the strategy, which I believe to be the remit of that group.
Now, the strategy board evolved from the FSS transition.
Yes. It's called the Forensic Policy Group.
Yeah. Now, I presume it must have a strategic focus. What is that?
Well, on the agenda this morning, they're talking about science, innovation and strategy. We're talking about quality.
So we might get an answer tomorrow morning.
Well, yes. It is early days for the group, but it's an encouraging start. And I sincerely hope that we do see a strategy emerging out of this sooner rather than later. But they're talking about market quality issues, my role and how we're going to put that onto a statutory footing, and work around the Implementation and Protection of Freedoms Act. Very topical issues.
Okay. Professor Silverman, you mentioned some of the stakeholders involved. How are specifically scientific interests represented on that group?
The group isn't majority science by any means. So the group is chaired by Stephen Webb, who I understand you will be speaking to next week, and so he will be able to tell you in detail how the committee works. But Alan Pratt, who is the Director for Science, Engineering and Technology, who, as I say, is my deputy, sits on the group. Rob Coleman, who is the head of the Centre for Applied Science and Technology, sits on it. And also, we now have within Home Office Science the National DNA Database Delivery Unit, and the head of that, Kirsty Faulkner, sits on the group. So the group has scientific input into its discussions, and I'm satisfied that that's at a level where they can make meaningful progress. And for example, this morning, and I'm glad to talk about that in more detail, there's a full list of different scientific activities that CAST are doing which support forensics right across the board, and I'm happy to discuss those if you'd like more details of them. So what we're doing is we're making sure that this board is fully cited on all the different aspects of work that we can provide to support them in their work.
So what is the mechanism for it pulling in information from all of the diverse
from the other
providers?
Stakeholders? Because I think actually, yes, Andrew, because you sit on the board.
There is an ongoing debate about whether the commercial providers should sit on that group. They don't at the moment, but plenty of other scientists do.
Well, if they're providing scientific innovation,
yeah,
one would have thought that their views ought to be taken into account.
And I tend to agree with that, and so there's an ongoing debate. They are in the process of forming a sort of operations level group that will sit below it, that will do more of the day-to-day work. And the early agreements I've reached is that there'll be considerably more scientists on that group as well. And that tends to be where the more detailed discussions are had anyway.
Stephen? Sorry, go ahead.
Excuse me.
How much is spent on basic forensic science research in this country? And do you know how that is funded?
Right. There's a range of different things. If I can start with, well, use the word basic research. Obviously, research goes from the very theoretical fundamental work, or what's called fundamental work, right through to applications in detail. And it isn't always possible to separate those things. So I'll talk about research more generally. First of all, there's work that we do in the Home Office itself, and the estimates we have is that CAST spends about £2 million a year. We outsource approximately £1 million to funded projects. In addition, we fund the National DNA Database Unit for about £1 million, but some of that is offset by income, and only some of that is spent on research. And then we spend about £1 million in support of Andrew Renaissance work, which he can talk about as well. So that's what we spend ourselves. Now, we have written out to the Home Office wrote out to the forensic service providers to find out how much they were spending on research. Some of them only gave us a percentage of turnover. Some of them said 5%, 9%, one cited 20 to 25%. But if we add up the actual figures that they gave us, we get to about £14 million a year. 14 million a year. But that's not necessarily all of it. That's not extrapolating to those that didn't necessarily reply. And also, in one case, they pointed to a product which they said they were working on, and they said that hadn't been included in the sums that they were giving us. So 14 million is a very conservative estimate of the amount spent there.
Can I just stop you there?
Yes, of course.
If that's forensic science in its entirety, including, for example, IT forensics? Because that's a very small figure if that's the whole picture.
I don't think that will include that. No, that will be, as I remember, that is almost entirely on non-IT forensics. So, because this is about work which is provided by people with whom we have service agreements. And if I look at who the large players are, they are working mostly on things like DNA and so on. So that's what's there. Then the research councils as such, and that's no doubt something you'd like to discuss. The research councils as such do not earmark money for forensics research because I think of the Haldane principle. So they are not, they are quite reluctant, aren't they, to provide earmarked funding. But on the other hand, there is work that is done which is in forensics, which will be funded by a whole range of different areas. And if we look at my review, which showed all the different pieces of research being done across different areas in Research Excellence Framework, all of those should in principle get some money back from research, from QR in the Research Excellence Framework. I'm sorry about the acronyms, but I imagine as the Science and Technology Committee you're familiar with them. And my hope was in my report, by drawing attention to the way that forensic science is part of so many different areas, it highlights the way in which parts of funding in all those areas will be going to forensic science. Then, of course, the research councils have set in place a special interest group through the Technology Strategy Board. That's not funding as such, so we could maybe talk about that later. And finally, EU funding. We have no specific figures for EU funding, but you will have received submissions, and some of your written submissions point to EU funding. One written submission you have suggests a funding of, for one person, €5 million, and one of the forensic science providers is involved in the FP7 program and is receiving an unspecified amount of funding from there. So I can't give an overall figure for the amount of money that's going into forensic science research, but I hope that gives an overview of the general picture there.
It does, and there's a number of follow-up questions. Can you tell us what activities occur in the Centre for Applied Science and Technology, and how they differ from work going on in universities and police labs and the private sector providers?
Yes, indeed. So let's first of all talk about fingerprints. So we have a unique and long-standing expertise in recovery and enhancement of fingerprints. Now that's not about fingerprint comparison or court testimony, but we produce a fingerprint manual, which we have done for many years, which is regarded as an internationally recognised manual of its type, and 1,200 of the previous version were published, 3/4 of those went abroad. It's been adopted as a standard text by Canada and South Africa, widely used within the USA. And so we have a whole group doing fingerprint development work, and their key customer group is the fingerprint development laboratory within police forces. And what we do is people in academia work on the early stage development of fingerprint imaging techniques, and we support that, for example, by part funding PhD students. But our role is to take that knowledge and test and validate it under operational conditions and develop best practice procedures that enable these techniques to be developed within the police. And this is a capability that's always been within CAST and its predecessor, and it wasn't something the FSS did. And so this is an example of something we do because nobody else does it and nobody else has the expertise and experience, and it's a very high priority. So that there is an example of a piece of work that we do, which is not, as it were, the blue sky stuff that's done in the academic world, but it's using that to get it out into practice. CCTV is another area which is very relevant to Andrew's recent appointment as the Surveillance Camera Commissioner, and we again have unique and long-standing expertise. We published an operational requirements manual as long ago as 1994, and here we work in partnership with industry, for example, via the British Security Industry Association. So again, that's not university-type work, that is work which is working with industry and is working directly to support Surveillance Camera Commissioner. We do work on the Protection of Freedoms Act, we do work on rapid DNA, so we are working on determining the most efficient and cost-effective applications for the use of rapid DNA systems. So again, this is not to develop rapid DNA systems, because that is the role of academia and industry, but to work out what is the best way that those should be used. and so on. I'm very happy to write in more detail to the committee.
You've given us a lot of detail already, but
yes.
that would be
yes.
very helpful. In your first answer, you talked about the research councils.
Yes.
As I understand it, you wanted forensic science to be a strategic priority within the research councils. Surely that was some conflict with the Haldane principle. I mean, choosing areas, I mean, the government chooses areas, they don't choose detailed pieces of work, but they say we'll spend X on astronomy. Surely just the research councils accepting your view that forensic science should be a strategic priority, shouldn't be beyond them. What was their response?
When I suggested in my report that it should be a strategic priority, what I meant was that there should be some way found to make it a priority. And I think that the Technology Strategy Board setting up its special interest group is the sort of way that they generally do this. And there are lots of good examples in other areas where special interest groups have led on to the formulation development of research which then competes for funding in the general, I won't use the word market, in the general situation. And so I was very pleased that the TSB were prepared to do that. And early indications are that it's going well. It has no money as such associated with it, but it is the way in which our research councils enunciate strategic priorities. So whether it's a strategic priority with a capital S and a capital P, I don't know, but it is certainly lowercase s, lowercase p, strategic priority, in that the TSB have taken that on board.
Thank you,
Sue.
Just on the special interest group,
Yeah.
you seem to be quite positive about it. What expectations do you have long term for what it will actually do?
The expectation, or at least the hope, is that it will provide a forum where we can both get better pull and better push. Better pull in that the actual user communities can become intelligent customers and then can formulate ideas and questions which can then be addressed by the academic community. And if that works well, then my hope is that high-quality scientists will be drawn into this area. People who can kind of decide which area to work in can be drawn into this area. And better push, because the hope is that the academic work that goes on will actually then become visible to the people that will use it. So it's the same principles as in any special interest group. And the whole idea is to draw together these different aspects of the research and development community. And all I can say is that in other areas this has worked well, which is why the TSB has devised this as a general approach to different areas of interest.
Okay. I know when Dr. Tully from Principal Forensic Services was in front of us, she did express this concern that there was money going into research at university level, there was money available for them to investigate cases, but then the bit in the middle, turning the research into stuff which is actually usable by the forensic is where the weakness is. I guess from what you're saying, that's where the special interest group fits in. Would you agree with Dr. Tully's?
Well, I would agree with her general view that the gap in between the so-called valley of death is what's really important. And also, I'm sure that in other of your work you talk to the Research Council and so on, they will say that that's why the Technology Strategy Board is set up the way it is. We know quite well that it doesn't, from experience, that it's not very easy for the government to pick winners and fund them, but what it can do is to provide a framework within which we can make this valley of death as small as possible, indeed eliminated if possible, so that you actually do get the join up and so that you can transition work smoothly from the original idea to practical application.
Okay. And in the answer to the previous question, you did go over the research market and the amount of money going in. Now that we've got these smaller private providers, are you seeing those providers specifically spending less money? I guess you're seeing them spending less money. Is that the case, or
no? We are getting, as I say, when we asked the question, they are spending amounts like 5% to 20% of turnover, which seems to me a healthy proportion to be spending on research and development. But I'm not a commercial expert, but from a naive point of view, I would have thought that those were quite healthy proportions to be reinvesting back into the future.
But we're told by some of the providers that their shareholders won't continue to back that principle unless there's clarity about what the market is.
I can't speculate about the future. I can only go on the evidence that
it's a reasonable presumption, isn't it? You wouldn't invest your money in something you thought had no use, would you?
Would I invest my money in something that I thought would have no use? If I were investing my money in a company whose job it was to provide a service, and I was told that they were investing a decent percentage in research for the future, I'd be quite pleased.
David.
Thank you, Chair. I wanted to ask you about the relationship with lawyers. Before I do, might I just take you back to your first question, where I think you said that the government doesn't have a strategy, doesn't appear to have a strategy at the moment. And I was looking through some evidence, and Selmar Forensics, in their evidence, said that the government's strategy was to allow a private forensic market to develop and to encourage competition between regulated forensic service providers. When I visited one on Monday, it was very obvious that they had been able to expand their business overseas to a large number of countries. And I put it to you that there is a government strategy and that it's working.
Well, I think I did hint at that in my very first answer. So there had been a historic government strategy which was about privatisation of the market. And that is working. But I think we've got to move beyond that now and look at the viability of the market in the UK and how we manage things here in the future.
Okay. Thank you very much. Is it difficult for lawyers to evaluate the competence and quality of a forensic scientist or provider?
Can I deal with that one? Yes, it can be. Yes, it can be. And I think it's fascinating how we've gone around in almost a complete circle here. And if you read this committee's report of 2005, where there were some lengthy comments about expert witnesses and expert evidence and recommendations made, that filtered its way through to the Office for Criminal Justice Reform, which was a joint Home Office Ministry of Justice team, who did a lot of thinking, a lot of consulting on the issue of how we regulate expert witnesses across all prosecution defence sectors, from all regions. They took advice from the Attorney General and senior judges, and as a result of that made recommendations to ministers that the solution to this is not a register, but we need to do some further work. So they passed it to the Law Commission, who put it into their programme of work, which I supported over a period of 3 years, a very lengthy and detailed and well thought through piece of work. The Law Commission published a consultation paper, published a final report in 2011, making what I thought were really solid recommendations around how we should manage expert witnesses in the future, to give the courts the powers, the real powers to manage experts, and lawyers the ability to assess them properly. Sadly, that now gathers dust, and I've seen no evidence that it's... And we're back to the same discussions again of 2005.
Thank you. So, I don't need to interrupt you, but then presumably you would agree with the Law Commission's 2011 proposals that there should be an admissibility test for expert evidence.
Yes, absolutely.
Expand on that.
Yes, wholeheartedly agree with that. And the test should be split into two. It's questions around the science that is being used on that occasion. Is that founded on a proper body of knowledge? It's the Bonifon tests. And is that person also an expert in that field and able to comment on that science?
Okay. Is there a lack of scientific literacy amongst the judiciary which stops scrutiny of forensic evidence? And if so, how could the situation be improved?
Well, the answer to that, if I'm brutally frank, is yes. There is a lack of scientific scrutiny and knowledge and ability, but the senior judiciary and lawyers fully accept that. They are not trained scientists. And I do have some very good discussions with Lord Justice Thomas and others of the Court of Appeal on exactly these issues, and they are looking for all the help they can get, and they've given me some pieces of work to do that will help them work their way through this.
It is part of the problem that it's not part of lawyers' training.
And the cultures are very different. the legal culture and the science cultures can be very different. They look at things very differently. The trick now is to try and find bridges across that. I am in some very early negotiations with a judge who sits on my advisory council and conversations I've got to take up with the Judicial College who train the judiciary around what training they can put out.
Okay, so do you think then, Mr. Ransom, that there should be some kind of formal assessment arrangement? I mean, I think there was... do you think we need something like the CRFP again?
No, I don't. I mean, CRFP was a register that was the government response in the late 90s, 1998, towards issues around quality failings in forensic science. But in 2008, early 2008, on the benefit of advice from the Attorney General, the Office for Criminal Justice Reform and others, ministers took the view that a register is not the solution to managing this.
But would you favour a stamp on the passport, some badge of rank that goes to a lawyer and says that this lawyer is basically accredited as able to understand evidence, rather than just winging it, as you might say?
I think there are two issues in there. I think it's one, whether the lawyer can manage the evidence. It's also whether the expert that they are using is competent. And you've had quite a bit of evidence about the competence of defence and other experts. Whether you could badge lawyers, I don't know. I really don't know whether we could achieve that. But I would like to see some badging of the training for lawyers and the information they have access to allow them to make some rational decisions.
Thank you very much.
Roger.
Thank you very much, Mr. Renison. You've been the pioneer as far as forensic science and regulation is concerned. How would you like to see it evolve in the next 5 years?
Well, I've got another year in post. That'll be the end of my 6-year tenure. I don't expect to be applying for a further term, but I'll wait and see. I haven't made a final decision. I would like to see some very clear plans in place for the 4 to 5 years after I leave. Principally, some very clear decisions made and consultation in flow around statutory underpinning for the post. I'd like to see some very serious thought given to the level of regulation that's required and the scope of regulation. So should the role include the regulation of defence expertise, because it doesn't at the moment. I would like to see that absolutely thought through with very clear plans and action happening as I leave, so that my successor can then take that to the next stage. I think we've reached the stage where I can do all I can reasonably achieve on a sort of voluntary consensus basis. And we have achieved a lot, and there's a lot of support out there. But I think we get to the stage where we need some statutory underpinning, particularly in these times of real austerity, to protect the integrity of science when there are other real pressures bearing on us. So over the next 5 years, I would like to see the codes of practice that I've developed expanding considerably further. There are whole new areas of forensic science that we haven't explored. There's one huge area I'm just stepping into, which I think could take another 3 to 5 years to resolve, which is medical forensics. The examinations of victims and suspects, particularly in serious sexual offences. We had a long and very healthy discussion about exactly that at my last advisory council meeting, and we are pulling together a group now to research that. The regulation of standards are very fragmented, a lot of very well-intentioned people in very different fields of work, doing lots of work, and none of it's coordinated and joined together. So a clear plan of action to carry on developing codes of practice, perhaps, or hopefully with some statutory underpinning over the next 5 years.
Yeah, I think you've perhaps covered the point I was going to make now, but do you think there should be some regulatory underpinning of the interpretation of results?
Yes, there should.
And,
yes.
how they're presented in court, for instance?
Yes, they should, and I have a small group looking at exactly that at the moment. It is possible to go for accreditation around interpretation, but it's not used. There is a growing demand for that to be used, but I need to publish some guidance, and we are working on that.
You've obviously achieved a great deal through the way in which you have carried out the work, but the Home Office, as I understand it, is committed to consulting on giving you statutory powers. Is there a timetable in the Home Office for that, or what in Home Office speak? How much time is that going to take?
That's a really good question. I'll be a bit wiser after this morning's policy group meeting, where there is a paper has been tabled on exactly this issue to explore scope and extent of regulation. I think we're on a 12-month timetable here, and during that 12 months I would really like to see a consultation paper published with some very clear government thinking set out, so that when I leave and my successor comes into post, they can carry that forward with a very clear course of action set out.
Thank you.
You said earlier accreditation doesn't cover defence. I think. Could you expand on what?
Well, the focus of my work has been police and the commercial laboratories that feed into the prosecution side of the fence. But in fairness to many defence science companies that specialise in working for the defence teams, a number of them have come forward, and I do work with them, I do liaise with them. I'm in Durham next week meeting with one of them, and I meet with them quite regularly. They've also moved their analytical processes through accreditation, so they have adopted the standards where they can and where they see fit. But that is achieved through discussion and consensus and negotiation with me. I have tried on a number of occasions to work with the Legal Services Commission to underpin that, because they pay for the majority of this work through the legal aid budgets. There was early interest about 3 or 4 years ago. They published a consultation paper in 2004 trying to pin some regulation through CRFP actually to the funds that they were handing out, but that all turned into nothing. They waited to see what my codes of practice said. Having published the codes of practice, I wrote to them again and said, right, would you like to adopt these now as a means of regulating defence expertise? I've had a very polite letter back saying no thank you. They've been through a whole review of their work. They are now pulled much closer back to the Ministry of Justice, and I've been referred to the Ministry of Justice to take up the discussion. And then I think that's part of today's discussions around the scope of regulation, which we'll have to address with the Ministry of Justice.
Is your concern that the lack of take-up would have a negative impact on the criminal justice system?
The lack of take-up of accreditation, and potentially yes, but accreditation doesn't provide all the answers.
No, absolutely.
I am doing a lot of work with experts in specific areas who would never go for accreditation. And forensic pathology is an example. We have published standards with the Royal College of Pathologists. We've done some very good work with the Institute for Archaeologists. They have published standards and guidance which I wholeheartedly endorse. They have an expert panel who are meeting at the end of this week where they set standards for their members. They set qualification standards. Well, we've done exactly the same with the forensic anthropologists. I've got a meeting on Friday with the Society of Chiropodists and Podiatrists to do the same for forensic podiatry. Where I can get the professional bodies involved, I'm absolutely delighted to do so, because they bring a whole new level and angle of regulation to this, which everyone can use.
Yes.
And so the people, for example, the forensic anthropologists I work very closely with, work for the defence as much as they work for the prosecution. But they now have standards they can work to, and they're published.
Thank you. Stephen.
Thank you, Chairman. I want to talk specifically about police forensic labs.
Yes.
There was concern, I think, when we've looked at this before, that police labs were not accredited, whereas commercial providers were.
Yes. Yes.
Are all police labs now heading towards accreditation? I know they've set priorities of 2013 and 2015 for DNA and fingerprints. They are all going for that, are they? They're going to reach it.
There is a huge programme of work which I have pushed as hard as I can, which has absolute support from the chief officers leading on this, Chris Sims, Chris Eyre, and the Deputy Chief Constable John Fletcher in Bedfordshire, who actually leads on the work. There's huge support and commitment to achieve accreditation for these labs. There are now 14 police forces working to accredited labs. There's actually about 7 labs accredited, but we're seeing huge numbers of sort of collaboration agreements being signed here. So 14 forces now work through accredited labs, and there are 31 other applications in with UCAS working their way through the system. All of that is absolutely mapped out. It's all on a very complex spreadsheet, where it was formerly the National Policing Improvement Agency. It's now a team at CAST are leading on that. And Bernard has the paper here where there's an absolute commitment from CAST to carry on that work and support police forces through this, because it is a hugely important project. But the chief officer leading on it, John Fletcher, has publicly stated that there is an absolute commitment here to their Vision 2020, which is for all police forensics to be working to the quality standards that I've set. In there are these early deadlines. So the first one is November this year for DNA activities. It is quite clear to me now there's a risk that some forces will miss that. So we're doing some work on what happens then. Well, the answer is very simple. They have to stop doing the work. And the only person I believe that can give them permission to carry on is the Secretary of State, because the UK would be in breach of a European instrument and the penalties would be quite significant. and the risk's huge. But they've had plenty of time to prepare for that and to put other strategies into place.
And do we know why they're going to miss that deadline?
It's time and effort.
On their part?
On their part. And we were very keen 2 years ago to have a very clear programme of work here, because I really feared there would be a bunching of effort as we got closer to the deadline, which would make it very difficult, almost impossible for the United Kingdom Accreditation Service to meet their expectations, and that's exactly what they're finding. Despite their best efforts, this bunching is happening, and they cannot quite understandably commit additional resources at the last minute to achieving that. That is all very clearly mapped out and understood now, and the rest can be managed.
I am right in saying that UCAS had put in additional resources to help.
They have. Yes. Yes. When they saw, and I worked very hard to get UCAS and the police planning together on this, and I've had a contract with UCAS to help oil the wheels. Quite frankly, you know, I've seen it in my benefit to fund some of this work, and we've seen some rewards from that. And as a result of the early police planning, UCAS have recruited additional dedicated assessors, 3 additional staff, which has had a very helpful impact.
Yes, I heard it was 5, but
well, they might have recruited 2 more since they last spoke to me, but yes, they will.
Thank you. You talked about the deadline, some labs missing the deadline of November 2013,
yes.
DNA, and then they will not be able to continue.
Yes.
Are there any labs at the moment doing police labs doing forensic work that are not accredited?
Yes. There are some labs
and who
doing... are they? I have a long list that I can work through at some stage. I don't think it's right to go through it here in detail, but we can write to you with that further information. In fact, I'll get the CAST team who lead on the project to liaise with you on that.
Okay.
I have agreed in the past to some limited screening work, particularly visual examination of items for blood, going ahead in the absence of accreditation. Come November this year, that will have to be accredited. But it's low-risk work, and it is subject to some very, very clear guidance that I agreed to that was published by the MPIA 18 months, 2 years ago. So, for example, if a police force takes a quite legitimate decision to take items of clothing out of a bag, examine them for blood, they close the door on any other forensic activity. So it's got to be a very clear part of their early strategy and thinking, and justify their reasons for doing this. But it does save them quite large amounts of money. There are still some swabbing and recovery of evidence going on. The more progressive police forces have that accredited already, but I'm limited what I can demand on that until the 2013 deadline. But most forces are on the right track to achieving the accreditation.
Okay, good. I mean, just changing track slightly, there has been some suggestions that it's becoming easier to challenge forensic evidence that has been gathered by police labs because of this accreditation issue. Have you seen any of that?
I haven't personally seen that, but it does seem entirely logical. I was fascinated to hear the evidence of, my memory of names is not good, so bear with me, Michael Turner QC and Richard Atkinson from the Law Society. I was fascinated to hear what they didn't know about standards and quality standards. And I suspect that they will go away much wiser and might be challenging more in the future. Some lawyers have cottoned onto this, and certainly when you look at cases in the Court of Appeal, you see more evidence that these issues are being questioned. But, can I share a real issue of disappointment here? Michael Turner QC represents the Criminal Bar Association. Richard Atkinson represents the Criminal Law Committee of the Law Society. Both those organisations have had seats at my advisory council for over 4.5 years. And I've done presentations to the Law Society. The gentleman that was behind Mr. Atkinson briefing him invited me in where I did a presentation about 2.5 years ago. And they listened very intently. And promised to get more involved. They have never attended. Sorry, the Criminal Bar Association have attended one meeting 5 years ago at my advisory council. They don't attend now. They get reminders of every meeting. So they have every opportunity to be far more involved in this and have more say in what's happening. And I shall be writing to them again to say, you'll remain invited to the central table where quality standards are discussed.
Could I encourage you to speculate why they're not engaged in this process?
I don't know the answer. I do from the Criminal Bar Association. The gentleman that was nominated to attend, and I have met with him, he just cites he's professionally far too busy. And he is. He's a very committed QC and he has a huge workload. I am prepared to try and I have said I'm prepared to try and amend our meeting times, etc., to early evenings and what have you, to try and accommodate some of that, but we'll keep trying.
Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
Just going back to the deadline, it seems to me that the risks go beyond simply the financial penalty. If you were a defence QC or a QC involved in a case post 2015, surely you would be inclined to bring to the judge's attention the failure of this wretched police force over all these years, that despite all the pressures from the regulator, they've not got up to standards that the regulator has set, and surely that would it's bound to become a tool to discredit police forensic evidence unless they meet those standards.
And I would, and if the Law Commission work had come to fruition, then the courts and others working for the courts, the lawyers, etc., would have far greater ability to question the standards that apply to this evidence that's coming through the system. Yes, of course, we will see more questions along those lines, but there are broader risks than that, Chair. There are remaining risks, of course, to the quality of the science that is delivered. So, let alone the question that happens around, are you accredited or not? You know, that's a fairly basic question. The more detailed question will be, what have you done to manage contamination, to avoid contamination in these handling of these DNA exhibits? You know, as we move, and we are moving to the new chemistries in DNA, contamination will become an ever-increasing issue that has to be very, very carefully managed. So we've got police forces that have to be very, very guarded and very careful that they are presenting legitimate evidence that hasn't been reduced in value because of poor quality work.
And where you have a police force, for example, that under the new regime is relying on its third-party provider or itself to archive material because there is no central system, that would present another chink in the armour or an advantage to the defence barrister to challenge the integrity of material that's represented in subsequent hearings.
Well, that has been a long-standing issue. I mean, the record of cold case reviews, I think, speaks for itself. And there have been some very, very successful reopening of old cases, and particularly the FSS archive was delved into, and samples were found, and cases have been solved. And actually, innocent people acquitted. You know, the case of Sean Hodgson of a few years ago is an absolute classic example. There was an archive in existence then. 10 years before he was acquitted, the FSS couldn't find the material. They tried again 10 years later, did find it, which led to him being acquitted. I think some questions were rightly asked at the time. So if there is to be an archive, it's got to be a very, very well managed archive.
It's got to be well managed.
Very well indexed.
If it's dispersed, if a number of different players take responsibility for their samples, there needs to be a consistent methodology in storing and indexing materials so that there cannot be challenges to the integrity of the data, but also so it can be found. Isn't that fairly obvious?
So it can be found. You've been to the archive to have a visit.
Yes, but I mean that's only dealing with past cases, isn't it?
And in future cases. I am undecided whether we need an all-singing, all-dancing central archive or whether you police forces do this on their own, as long as it's done properly. I have agreed to write the guidance on how samples should be stored.
But there needs to be a single indexing system so that police forces across the country can search other people's archives.
Well, some of that indexing exists already because it's actually the crimes you're looking for, not necessarily the forensic exhibits. And the police work very hard on linking crimes, and I can give you some good examples where there's been successes in that. And we have, as Gary Pugh mentioned, you do have the DNA database which links across different samples and cases. You have the fingerprint database which does the same, and we have now the National Ballistics Information System which does the same. I think there needs to be some very, very careful thought given, and I'm happy to support this, to the benefits of what you want against the costs and the effort of achieving that.
So if you decided that it's okay for the current arrangements to continue, that future cases will be the responsibility of that particular police force to
Yes.
determine. Would you include in that the option of the police force entering into a contract with the Central Archive?
Yeah, that's one option. And I think you heard evidence from others that this is all open for review and is being
Certainly,
discussed. And
the
it should
views
be.
the views of the private sector are that would be just another burden on them.
Yes,
An
but you know, it's not necessarily just the case files. These providers all have good electronic information systems of their own, which people can access, but none of that is linked together, so that is worth exploring for the future.
Okay. David?
On that point, I'm slightly surprised you're saying that the police, you're not too concerned about which direction this goes, because I would have thought having a central store is much easier. But isn't the way, if you're going to go down the route of having devolved storage of data, then there absolutely has to be very clear interfaces, one, very clear rules, and a common information technology system. Otherwise, we're going to get back into a situation which is a notorious problem amongst police forces where they have incompatible computer systems. Will you comment on that, please?
I think it's a good vision to aim for. The police have struggled for years to achieve integration of these computer systems, and it's hugely costly. Perhaps if they're starting afresh, then there might be a solution. I just think that's part of the ongoing project that really has to be thought through very carefully and all the benefits weighed up. I'm struggling to see huge benefits achieved from that, what I think the costs would be. I think there are some wider issues that we need to consider as well. I think it goes beyond just the commercial providers and the police. What about forensic pathologists? What about some of the other niche experts? So perhaps that argues in favour of a central archive. I'm happy to support the ongoing considerations.
Yeah,
of
but
that.
where's the capital going to come from to set up local archives? And isn't that really a waste of money when there is a central resource that's...
Where would the capital come from for a central resource? It'll almost certainly come out of police budgets.
Police budgets.
With police and crime commissioners now, I'm not sure I see them as a priority, as a priority for them setting up an archive. If I go and say there's antisocial behaviour in Barwell, we're fed up with it. That's an issue that raised me. That's the kind of issue I hope they'll be making a priority, and I think this is going to go right down the list. And I really fear for fragmentation. I just can't see how you can have all these little tiny pots of information and have proper coordination that isn't likely to break down and be very expensive to manage. I just can't see it. It defies the logic. Keep it all together. It's easy to access.
And I think that's part of the ongoing debate that has to be had and very, very carefully thought through against all the costs, because it's those police and crime commissioners, you've got to draw into that debate now, will incur that cost, however it is worked out. I don't see the government paying for it.
Not going to be a very high priority. Moving on to forensic science skills, what impact has the loss of forensic scientists from the profession had on R&D and the criminal justice system, please?
Well, without doubt, huge numbers of people have left the profession, and that's bound to have a negative impact. I am seeing a very small positive impact. There are some very resourceful people there who have remained in the industry. And
but the market was contracting anyway.
Yes.
So isn't that a natural thing to have?
Well, not in those large numbers. I think we have seen a large number leave the industry in a very short space of time, and it carries on. There is some reshaping carries on even now. So there are, I think, about 150 staff at LGC Forensics that are being consulted on with at the moment. But, put that in the context of wider policing numbers reducing. 10,000 police officers have gone in the same period of time. The CPS has lost almost 11% of its resources. All of that is having a huge impact on investigation of crime and an impact on the criminal justice system.
Okay, is this loss of staff solely attributed to the FSS closure, or is there something else there that we're missing?
No, I think the single biggest cause of all of this is just reductions in spending. It's budgetary.
So demand driven?
Yes.
Lack of demand. Demand's collapsed,
yes.
So there's no, so people lose their
Across
jobs.
the board. The comprehensive spending review resulted in police forces being told to reduce by 20% over 4 years. The vast majority of police forces decreased their spending on forensic science by 25%, or by 20% overnight. and some reduced by a further 15% the following year, because the discretionary budget for forensic science was a cash pot that was instantly identified.
But aren't we going to get better value for money here if police give up the turf of some of their localised forensic services and take it to these much bigger, better resourced companies? I mean, isn't it this, like we used to amalgamate the small councils to make more efficient councils? I mean, what's the point of having small constabularies struggling to maintain not particularly well resourced, let's use the resource word? I mean, is it not an economy of scale issue very important when you're having all these reductions?
And isn't that what they're doing?
Well, I'm not sure that it is the case. I think that some police forces are defending their turf and want to maintain their forensics.
Well,
on the grounds that it's local and it's important for us to have it.
You do see varying patterns of behaviour. I witnessed some good examples of collaboration amongst forces to achieve exactly that, economies of scale. So the East Midlands is a good example where 3 forces have done exactly that. Surrey and Sussex are doing the same. Many are doing the same. I think the route through this are more regional collaborations. Fingerprints is a classic example where I think huge economies of scale could be achieved.
We were told the North East is a good example. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I mean, 6 or more forces have got together and they are collaborating as a single unit. There are huge economies of scale to be made, and they are beginning to collaborate on fingerprints. Others could do the same. So do we necessarily need 43 fingerprint bureau around the country, or could we operate with 10 or 12? Far more efficient in my view, and I know there is some serious thought being given to that.
Just in the case of fingerprinting, I mean, there was an attempt in the Northwest to merge several forces, but the prevailing view amongst the fingerprint officers themselves was that they weren't worried about a single managerial structure, but saw massive disadvantages in focusing on a single location. I mean, things like fingerprints don't. The specialists don't have to themselves be centralised, do they?
I don't see why not. There is resistance to that change, and I think that's what you've witnessed there. And the Northwest is taking a different approach to this.
I mean, the travel time to get to a scene of crime does factor into costs.
Yeah, but that is managed through another part of the process. What I'm thinking more in terms of the bureau, that they stay in the office and they do the comparison work. It is very desk-bound type of work that could be centralised. I do think in the future, because I'm launching a whole new raft of standards for fingerprints on the 21st of this month, and I think that will cause some of the smaller forces to think how they operate, because there has to be a sort of minimum size in terms of numbers that you have to have in place to achieve the standards that I want. I think in answer to Mr. Tadinick's comment, yes, of course, economies of scale. I think in the future that some of this work will be outsourced as well. Why not? Why would you not want to regionalise and then consider outsourcing things like fingerprint work? Historically, it's always been done by the police. Some chief constables have said to me, why don't we outsource that in the future?
Okay. Last question for you from me. How many FFS staff transferred into the Centre for Applied Science and Technology, and could more have been transferred?
I don't know the answer to that.
I think directly, I think the answer is 1, and it was for a project based on about type approval of drug driving devices, which I'm very happy to discuss because I think it's a very interesting project where CAST has on time put in place what needs to be done so that the government can introduce a new offence of driving when under the influence of drugs, or driving with a certain amount of drugs in the bloodstream, and that is ongoing work at the moment, and I'm really delighted with the work that's been done. There's some very, very good science. It required quite a lot of investment, a lot of very hard work, and I'm very pleased with it. There wasn't I don't think there was any other work that was within CAST's remit that would have involved taking on staff from the Forensic Science Service, and so the short answer is that was the member of staff that was taken on.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. I think there's a final question, Mr. Ennison. It's about the procurement framework. We've heard concerns being expressed about the commoditisation of the process, and the argument that we're not going to have a holistic approach to a crime scene as a result of that. And we had one very good description from a private provider with illustrations where simply, for example, sending a trainer that had a blood mark on it didn't give a holistic picture, and that all that proved was that there was blood on the trainer, whereas splatter analysis up the inside of the trouser leg should have been associated with it. Isn't commoditisation a problem, and doesn't it put some of the valuable work of forensics at risk?
It's shifted some of the decision making that historically was done in the forensic science laboratory, where the whole case was reviewed, all the exhibits were reviewed. It shifted that decision making back into the hands of the police force that makes those decisions on which exhibit to sample from, which to send, and the instructions they give to the laboratory. The police are very aware of those risks. The risk is managed if there then are proper bridges of communication. And you heard other witnesses talk about bridges of communication, if they are working effectively. And I have run workshops on this, and it's absolutely vital. So if that risk is shifted to the police, then the laboratories have got to have very good and open lines of communication to then share, to discuss the case with the police and advise if they feel it's necessary to do so, and for the police to ask questions. And it's varying patterns of behaviour across the country. I see good examples of very, very good communication. In some areas, I think there's more could be done. And what I want to see in the future is, as the accreditation rolls out to police laboratories and to the units that the police units handling this, is that the United Kingdom Accreditation Service, and they can do this and they will do this, are then assessing the bigger picture, not assessing each organisation in isolation. And they look at these bridges of communication and check whether the whole flow of a case is seeing best value and best practice.
Yeah, there's a snag though, isn't there? Because if, let's just take that same example, I'm the contractor that's been asked to look at the blood on the shoe, and as the forensic scientist, I said to you as the purchaser, look, Mr. Renison, I think if you gave me the trousers as well, I'd be able to produce much more information. Your procurement manager, who I suspect would not be a scientist and probably not even a serving police officer, would say, private sector, they would say that, wouldn't they? We are going to get negative pressures that will potentially damage the process.
And that is a very sad consequence and outcome of the severe budget pressures that these police forces are under. And it is there is a negative consequence to this.
So you'd be urging chief constables to be very careful of that and make sure there is, at least in using your bridge example,
yes,
which I accept,
yes,
a bridge which ensures that the best quality and information is obtained.
And I think, and there is some further work to be done on this. We discussed exactly this at my advisory council in February, and the result of that is that we've agreed that I will run some threatening audits of cases through the system just to test exactly that. And I've had one early discussion. I think there are more discussions to be had with the likes of the National Audit Office, because if it's how do you view value for money here? If at the police end upstream you see value for money being achieved, is there any real assessment of impact further downstream? Because you've made your savings there. Who is seeing the whole picture? And I'm not sure that whole picture is being seen at the moment. It's been properly evaluated. Okay. And I think there's some further work should be done on that.
Are you looking at Scotland and Northern Ireland, who are approaching things slightly differently,
yes, I am.
To determine what works best?
Yes, I am. My role, as you know, is England and Wales, but we reached very early agreements with the authorities in Scotland and Northern Ireland to collaborate. And I'm in Belfast regularly. I'm in Glasgow talking to Tom Nelson regularly. In fact, I'm there next week at a conference. Yes, we explore that, and we look internationally as well at what works.